Hey everybody, this is Garrett with Earth and Time, and today I'm coming to you from a very special place in downtown Manhattan, i.e. New York City. And right behind me sits Fraunces Tavern. Fraunces Tavern was established in 1762 and was one of the hangouts for the founding fathers, as in the Revolutionary fathers, and was home to a lot of important events. So come join me today. Let's check out Fraunces Tavern from 1762. Let's get to it. All right, so I moved across the street and let's go take a look inside of Fraunces Tavern. I can't believe I'm going to somewhere that's been here since 1762, as well as was a hangout for people like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, Clinton, Adams, all these famous founding fathers, Knox, all hung out here. I'm so excited to take you all with me. So let's go take a look at Fraunces Tavern. So when you first walk in, it definitely has this ambiance of the old tavern, so they definitely kept the feel of that. And you can both eat here as well as go upstairs and check out the museum. So let's go do the museum first, and I'm going to grab a bite to eat while I'm hanging out here. But before I go upstairs, check out this old dining room that sits off of the main entrance. Can you imagine all the Revolutionary War heroes all hanging out in this room, eating a meal here that was supplied to them by Fraunces and the Fraunces family? All right, so there's 3 floors. The first floor is a restaurant and bars. The second floor is where you go pay admission, so it's $5 for me to go. And they have a hall to George Washington, as well as one of the most famous rooms and important rooms in American history, the long room. I'm going to start by going into the long room. Now, for anybody who's seen Alexander Hamilton or is familiar with that play, this would be like the room that they were trying to mimic in that play, where all the early Revolutionary War individuals were all hanging out. Alexander Hamilton, they had Lafayette hanging out there. However, Lafayette never would have hung out here during that time, but some of the early Revolutionary War heroes definitely would have been here pre or at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and then at the very end as well. It's worth noting that New York City was captured very early on in the Revolutionary War and actually ended up being occupied all the way until the end in about 1783. So this was the hub of the British Army. So that means that some of the famous generals that you can think of, Howe, Cornwallis, probably all sat and ate in here as well. Although we don't celebrate them, it's interesting to be in a place of history like this where so many important figures from history coalesced into one building. Why this room is probably most important is because this is where Washington held his farewell after the British left New York City on December 4th, 1783. George Washington got together with all of his generals and officers, which you can see pictured here, and this is where he had that farewell celebration, really marking the end of the war. Now, once he became president, he also would spend time here, which makes it an important place. But this room specifically is where that moment took place, where Washington said goodbye to all his troops after a long, hard, arduous campaign and war, making this a very important room and one that's truly capturing history. The other thing that happened in this room, or so the stories say, is this is actually the room where Alexander Hamilton and Burr actually had dinner with a bigger group of folks not too long before the duel, approximately a week before the duel that would end up killing Alexander Hamilton, which occurred across the river. But they would have eaten here as well. So this was a regular haunt of Alexander Hamilton's, Burr's, all the founding fathers for a period of time, in both pre the Revolutionary War as well as afterwards in the 1780s. And all I can say is wow, and just think about the presence of the important individuals to history that sat in this room, had parties in this room, probably drank a little too much in this room and got a little carried away in this room, but to be here is pretty exciting and definitely something that was on my bucket list. So not only was Fraunces Tavern the seat of celebration a lot of times, but actually became part of the Department of War, where the first secretary, Henry Knox, took over from 1785 to 1788 and used these as his office, or this area as his office. Now, Henry Knox, famous for what we know as Fort Knox, where they keep all the gold bars, quote unquote, he was a brilliant artillery general during the Revolutionary War and ended up becoming the first Secretary of the Department of War, and Fraunces Tavern was his headquarters for about 3 years. And it also became part of the Department of Foreign Affairs. So Fraunces Tavern became the center of so much of what was happening in early America in the very formative years of our young country. And you can see Secretary John Jay was the gentleman who was in charge of the Department of Foreign Affairs. And the offices were here from 1785 to 1788. And it's worth just a pan through. One thing you can look at as well as the wallpaper, which was put here much later, obviously, just showing scenes from the Revolutionary War. Now, this was also the Board of Treasury's office as well. So this place was the center of a lot of the early American government. And it all took place here at Fraunces Tavern, which if you were like me, I knew nothing about until I started doing research when I knew I was coming to New York City. But this is such an important place in early American history. One of the other interesting artifacts here is they actually have a bust of George Washington. Now, they have a collection of pictures of George Washington painted and drawn by a lot of people, but being that this is a bust, and as I understood it was actually molded from his actual face, where he had to have straws sticking out of his nose for like 3 hours, this may be the best representation of what George Washington actually looked like. Pretty neat to see it in person. And they have all kinds of sketches and a whole section here dedicated to George Washington, who was, even before the Revolutionary War, a regular of Fraunces Tavern. And all the different pictures from different time periods of George Washington. Now, if I work my way up to the 3rd floor, they have a couple interesting exhibits up here. One, look at that glass, very pretty. But it's fun walking up these old stairs, wondering who all walked up along this area to these upper floors. So here's a little bit about dining at Fraunces Tavern. Samuel Fraunces had 14 people working with him. And I apologize, you may hear some construction sounds in the background. They're working on the other side of the wall from me. But this really shows what private dining would look like. So he actually had private dining rooms here, and people have been recorded like Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, who was said to come here and eat fried oysters. So oysters were a key part of the diet here in New York. In fact, they have oysters on the table, and they had big oyster beds that they would harvest from just at the very end of Manhattan here, which were a short 5-minute walk from the tip of that area. And oysters were one of the mainstays for diets here, along with things like corn, and you can see pork and green beans and regular beans or lentils all on this table with some bread and then some other types of fruit in the background. Knowing that George Washington ate in this area in some of these private rooms, Paul Revere, John Hancock, of course Alexander Hamilton, Burr, the list probably goes on and on. Those are just a few of the individuals that they mentioned here. Of course, we learned that Knox was here, as well as J. Adams, all these famous dignitaries and Revolutionary War heroes. In this room, they also have some other interesting displays. Like here's a slipper that belonged to Martha Washington. A bust of Alexander Hamilton in a very Romanesque or Greek style. They have a lock of George Washington's hair. How crazy is that? And this individual has a lot of places dedicated to him. So his name is George Clinton, not like in George Clinton and the Parliament Funkadelic, although really good band. But George Clinton, who was a Revolutionary War general, and there's a place called Castle Clinton here, and there's Fort Clinton in the area. He also became a governor of New York State. In fact, he was the first American governor of New York State and was quite the dignitary. And this was his sword and scabbard from 1777. So this is what he would have had with him during the Revolutionary War. And here's a picture of him. It may be one of the most important events for the freeing of enslaved people prior to the American Civil War was what happened during the Birch trials, where 3,000 black loyalists were allowed to leave. Although initially, after the Revolutionary War, and there was actually a decree that wouldn't let them leave initially, but they held what were known as the Birch trials here. They were actually able to leave in 1783, kind of the latter part of 1783, which would be the largest freeing of enslaved people in the United States up until the American Civil War. So, and that happened right here at Fraunces Tavern. With George Washington looking over my shoulder, I want to thank you all for joining me today to learn about Fraunces Tavern, learn about the amazing history here, the fact that this building stands in Lower Manhattan since 1762, knowing all the change that's taken place around it, the fact that this is where George Washington had his farewell address, this is where they had the Birch trials at. It was also the offices of some of the first government officials post the making of the new nation. So really fascinating history. I'm glad I got to come here and experience it with you all. So with that being said, you all know what to do. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Please leave me comments. Tell me if you've been here, if you ever heard of Fraunces Tavern or the Birch trials or knew anything about any of these events. A lot of these were first for me, and I'm really glad I got a chance to come here and share them with you all. So with that being said, take care. We'll see you all in the next adventure. Bye now.